Our first presentation this afternoon is from Sally Burgess. Sally's going to talk about connecting the dots using a geographic information system to manage the cultural landscape of Perth Airport, Western Australia. So Sally has recently completed her honours in archaeology, graduating with a high distinction. She works as an advisor in heritage at the Perth Airport, and it is this landscape that provided the case study area for her project. And as you'll hear, I'm sure, from Sally, a bit of a pivot in terms of career paths. I've known Sally for a long time, so I'm looking forward to the presentation. And just a reminder, QR codes for any questions, and really encourage you to ask questions. You can send them through while Sally's presenting, while they're fresh in your mind, and then we'll get to them at the end of her presentation. So please make welcome Sally.
Thanks, Mandy. Hopefully everyone's had enough sugar and caffeine. Okay, this is Perth Airport. It's a place of unique heritage, and it has many complex heritage management challenges. 2,105 hectares. That's about 5 times the size of Cutagarup or Kings Park, and it's the same size as Rottnest Island. That's Wodjima. 63 known heritage places. 2 of these were recently dated to 41,000 years of continued occupation. 16 million people journeyed through Perth Airport last year, and $3 billion in development investment is committed to over the next decade. Kaya. As a non-Indigenous person, I pay my respects to the Whadjuk Noongar people and their elders past and present, on whose lands I work and study and live. And I extend my respect to First Nations people that are here with us today. I particularly want to acknowledge the families of the Perth Airport Partnership Agreement Group, who we call the PAG, and the team at CARTA who worked on the cultural map. Both these teams, as the traditional owners for this study area, have graciously supported me through this project. Today I'm going to walk you through my archaeology honours thesis, and I completed that last December. In this project, I mapped tangible and intangible heritage values across Perth Airport's cultural landscape for the first time through the development of a GIS application, which we call the GIS app. And as a proof of concept in this project, Aboriginal and non-Indigenous histories spanning deep time to the recent past were mapped. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background in the presentation, just to give you some context leading into my research question. But thanks to some of the talks earlier today, I'm not going to have to bog you down in the literature review and all the theory. There's some of the items that came from the keynote speech earlier today, and some of Amy's stuff from the Murrujuga Aboriginal Corp. Some of those concepts come through in my project as well, so I was really thrilled to hear the words that they had to say earlier today and know that it kind of ties in. After I've given you some background and I go through my research question, I'm just going to go straight to the results and dive in and show you what I found. I worked on 3 sort of mini case studies within the case study area of Perth Airport, and it provided a novel application of GIS in spatial archaeology. Not very good with the button. One more, come on. Or maybe I've clicked it 3 times now. Let's see how we go. The theoretical basis of this project draws on landscape archaeology, with a focus on cultural landscapes and the nature-culture divide, which in this project led to considering nature with culture, which we heard a little bit about this morning. I'm also looking at spatial archaeology, which informed the methodology I used, and that was why GIS was selected. And in using GIS, I was looking at both quantitative and qualitative approaches of GIS. And because of Perth Airport's geographic location, archaeology of the Swan Coastal Plain applies. Specifically, what we know about sites being associated with sandy rises near wetlands. So, environmental indicators of cultural heritage has been considered. In regard to cultural heritage management, the concept of heritage values were explored a little more to include both tangible and intangible heritage values. Okay, thanks, Matt. The airport's a place we're all familiar with. There's terminal buildings, there's runways, and if you ask the bell tower times, there's car parks as well. But there's more to Perth Airport than just planes. For heritage management, it's a place of great complexity. If you pay attention to the images on the screen here, you'll notice those two orange circles picking up the terminal buildings, Terminal 3-4, which is where Qantas operates out of, if you're familiar with flying out of there. Otherwise, Terminal 1 and 2. So for the FIFOs and anyone who goes around doing heritage work remotely, that's Terminal 2. And Terminal 1's your international building and the Virgin Pier. You can see in this image the runways intersecting and going between these. Paying attention to those orange circles, you can see in this next image that those terminals and the runway only make up a part of the airport. The Perth Airport estate is essentially a huge wetland. It's located on federal land, which means it operates under complex tiers of legislation. We've got Commonwealth legislation with DQ, we've got state legislation such as the Aboriginal Heritage Act. We also operate under the Airports Act. And on top of that, with lessons from Juukan Gorge, it highlights the importance of social licence and management perspectives that go beyond this compliance. So with this in mind, it led me to my research question. How can GIS help capture tangible and intangible heritage values across Perth Airport's cultural landscape to better manage heritage and service social licence in the context of increasing development demands and legislative uncertainty? Next to consider was where to start with the data. For Aboriginal cultural heritage management, the obvious place was ACHIS, the GIS web view of all the listed sites across Western Australia. However, in the context of my research question, which I've just gone through, there's obviously some limitations. So I set out to develop a spatial application or a GIS app that goes a little bit further than this. I developed a desktop application that was inclusive of qualitative and quantitative data. Not all the capabilities of GIS were used. I limited my project to visualisations and spatial analysis. And of course, as some of the earlier presentations that we've seen, there's a lot more that can be done with GIS and technology. So in doing this development, I started with a framework of 3 layers. And these included, like I mentioned before, quantitative and qualitative data sets. The first layer was the base maps. These are things like your satellite images and your aerial photography. The next layer was heritage, which was obvious to include. And based on the nature-culture divide, or trying to bring nature and culture closer together, I also included a third layer, which was the environmental. The app was designed, as you can see in this image here, with 4 view panels as its interface. To the left, there's some functions for editing and location referencing. The central panel is the map viewer. To the right, there's functionality for layers and for bringing in other data sets. And at the bottom, there was a panel to enable some of the new widgets and tools that you can bring into some of these new GIS interfaces. Secondary public available data was sourced, most of which was environmental and heritage in nature, coming from Data WA. Some other historical archival data was used, which I sourced from Trove. So to start, as you can see in this image here, the app was benchmarked initially just with the ACHIS data in the heritage layer to check for functionality. And then once I was sure that it was functioning with the HIS data that was feeding into it, I then tested all the 3 layers. So I messed around with some of the satellite imagery, some aerial imagery, and I was pretty comfortable that the base layer was working. And after that, I also just picked some random environmental sort of data sets from Data WA. Once I'd done that and I was confident that all those layers were working and the app was functioning properly, the final step, I set out to connect some dots. I used 3 case studies as a proof of concept. The first one, nature with culture. It focuses on an area called Monday Swamp, which is an area of great Aboriginal cultural heritage significance in the upper eastern section of the Perth Airport estate. I was looking at environmental indicators of heritage in this first case study. The second was the aircraft crash site. It's in an Aboriginal cultural heritage site known as Allawa Grove, recognised for really significant heritage values for Aboriginal people, both deep time and some contemporary histories. It's to the northeast of the estate. But my goal in this sense was looking at non-Indigenous histories and rediscovering some lost histories from an aviation disaster. The third case study was the cultural map, and that focuses across the entire estate using Indigenous knowledge as data. Case study 1 looks to map nature with culture. This takes an estate-wide perspective to consider the broader cultural landscape across Perth Airport. I used the Enviro layer in the app to look at elevation, water, soil and vegetation. And as there is a known association of archaeology with areas of elevation, which we call sandy rises. So elevation was investigated as an example to try and locate tangible heritage. The app enabled different approaches to visualise and identify associations with these examples. The first one, the top left, you can see the sandy rises were marked out in green and the wetlands in blue, and these were traced from the oldest aerial image I could get, which was from 1953. The disturbance areas were traced in red and they were then identified as well. So given that the sandy rises could be identified from this data set, it was a data set that showed less disturbance than what we had today. So it was telling us something different than if we look at the aerial images and what we know about the landscape as it looks today. The bottom left shows an analysis of a smaller cultural landscape within the estate around Monday Swamp. I used some LiDAR data here to do a more detailed topographic information review with the elevation profile tool used for an alternate perspective of these rises. And on the bottom right, I took this same LiDAR data and I treated it with a multi-directional hillshade. This was used to visualise these rises in a different way, and when overlaid with the heritage site data from HIS, the alignments could be observed. As you can see in this image here, with site 3935 and 3896. There were also some other rises that popped out of this image, along with some disturbance areas as well. The association of heritage sites with these sandy rises or areas of elevation in proximity to wetlands was tested using a chi-square goodness of fit calculation. So using GIS, I was able to generate 180 random points, punch them into the calculator for the chi-square goodness of fit, and it showed that the association is not random, and it validated this tendency for sites to be associated with sandy rises. There's also some other potential environmental indicators where this approach could be used with other data sets. So for example, we could look at soil and sandy soil types and see if there's an association there. We could also look at hydrological data, which would tell us something about the wetlands and proximity to wetlands compared to sandy rises, and potentially also vegetation communities, thinking about what types of plants prefer to grow on sandy rises as compared to those that grow in wetland areas. Due to the limitations of an honours project, I wasn't able to explore those, but the work that I did with the LiDAR data and the other data sets for sandy rises showed that the GIS, it would be a capability to be able to bring these in and do a similar sort of test. However, this left me with the question of intangible heritage. So to investigate this, I decided to look at culturally significant species. For Aboriginal cultural heritage, one such species is the mudjar tree, which we know as the WA Christmas tree. It's of extreme spiritual significance to Noongar people. And this species was ideal for analysis using aerial imagery due to the highly visible flowering patterns that you can see in the peak of summer. And as seen on the left, the 2018 aerial image was taken in December and it shows the flowering trees. So I dropped a pin on each visible flowering tree across the estate. And from the image on the right, you can see it gives a very different perspective of heritage values across the airport estate. From the green pins, when compared to the HS sites in the hatched green areas, there's no alignment here between the intangible heritage and what we know as our legislative heritage sites. In this case, it shows that the tangible and intangible heritage values across the estate don't necessarily align, which is really important to recognise considering this intangible heritage isn't afforded the same legislative protection. Case study 2. This takes a different approach. It looks at a different area in the north of the estate, as I mentioned before, called Allawa Grove, which is protected for its Aboriginal cultural heritage values. In this case, however, I've used GIS to explore non-Indigenous heritage. In 1949, a DC-3 aircraft crashed shortly after takeoff. All 18 people were killed on impact. It was the largest aviation disaster in WA of its time. There's no ongoing recognition of the event and the crash site at Perth Airport is unknown. So the aim here is to find the crash site using GIS. The images to the left are some examples of the archival research I pulled from newspaper articles and images, which I dug out of Trove. The central image shows how I identified each of the key features of the crash site from these images, and I triangulated them to get a perspective and orientation to align all of these images into one scene. After that, the right image shows how I was then able to create a sketch of the crash site layout. I then went back to that 1953 aerial image, which is the one on the left, and I traced features like buildings, which are in orange, and roads in blue. And I mapped the flight path, which is the red line. And from accounts in the paper, I was able to then correlate this to the sketch and identify the location of the crash site, marked out by the white square. Next, in the image to the right, I replaced that 1953 image and underlaid the most recent aerial image we have and can now confidently place this aviation disaster in the current landscape, a new dot on the map, which will be useful for fieldwork that will be needed to ground truth this finding. Finally, in case study 3, I decided to really push the theoretical limits of GIS with the cultural map, a qualitative data set. The cultural map is a really impressive 3 by 3 metre painted canvas, and as a map, it's an artist's interpretation, although it's based on archaeological data sets and GIS mapping. It's overlaid with stories from oral histories. And the work of Carter, Barb and Farley and the team of Indigenous traditional owners and others that helped produce this map, and their support was really crucial for my studies. It captures an estate-wide perspective of Indigenous knowledge and intangible heritage values. So, a high-resolution image was taken and I imported it into GIS, and then I geo-referenced and geolocated it in the app using landmarks. You can see on the image there's a couple of landmarks in here that were really useful. They're painted in white, they're the terminal buildings, and you can see the runway being marked up in between that as well. This case study challenged further consideration of the purpose of data and GIS as a communication tool. It questions ideas of accuracy, especially as there's limitations that were observed in a more typical quantitative use of GIS. You can see some alignment between the rivers and the roads and the estate boundary if you have a look at that circle where it's zoomed in a bit more around the top of the Woggles Head. However, there's also misalignment in some areas. You can see between the pink line, which is the GIS estate boundary, and the dashed red painted line. There is, though, some alignment in the Woggle's body, the rainbow serpent, with both Monday Swamp and patterns on the body corresponding with some of the heritage sites that are overlaid. Similarly, campsites and heritage sites that are depicted with some accuracy, illustrated by symbols and iconography in the cultural map, corresponding with some of the numbered site boundaries that we brought in from HS. It showcases the traditional owner perspective, which has some alignment with heritage and environment data, but not in a way that's useful for compliance. So then perhaps this is more suited to social licence. Importantly, it places Indigenous knowledge in equal standing alongside scientific data, making it more than just a painting on the wall, but also a really valuable data set in its own right, now stored, captured and visualised in the Perth Airport GIS system. This case study challenged assumptions and it raised some questions about GIS and the mapping the purpose of heritage management. Specifically, who is it actually for and what's the real objective here? And as a default layer now on GIS at Perth Airport, this layer shifts perspectives and it sets the tone for users of GIS about how to think about heritage and land management beyond the dots on the map. So what's next? There were plenty of challenges in this project, notably with some of the limitations, given that I was working with publicly accessible data and a real reliance on the GIS system at Perth Airport. However, it doesn't detract from the findings, which have ongoing application in the management of cultural heritage at Perth Airport. This applied research project has shown that it is possible to connect the dots through place, through time, and through cultures. It highlights the power of maps as a management tool. And there is plenty further potential that remains in this work. There's possible application of this beyond Perth Airport, even beyond the Perth area. Inclusion of statistical predictive modelling would be really interesting as well, along with advancements as we saw in some of the presentations earlier in GIS with 3D, 4D and even AI capabilities. The collection of primary data and the support of field work will also be useful. As an employee of Perth Airport, I've been afforded the opportunity to do this research and I really extend my thanks to Perth Airport and the team for their support, particularly Rod from the GIS team. Could not have done this without him. Likewise, the exceptional teaching and mentoring of Sven Usman and Joe Dortch through UWA was instrumental in the success of my work. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sally. Questions? Yes, up the back. Thanks.
I just wondered, that was really interesting, thank you. I just wondered, have the results from your work, will that lead to any changes within the airport? Like, is there anything significant that's come out that the airport management will sort of take on board?
Thanks. Is that one? Thanks for your question. I believe so. I think the main thing for me was having that cultural map as the default layer. So now when anyone within the business goes to look at heritage at Perth Airport, be they project managers or people in other teams in planning or wherever in the business they are, the first thing they see in GIS now is that cultural map and they have to turn that off to get to other data sets. The other thing I think that's interesting as well is bringing all those environmental layers and data sets into the heritage app. So when people go to heritage now, they see all the environment data and it generates a conversation with the environment team, which part of, I guess, the intent as well was to bring that heritage and environment closer. Simple things too, like the dots from the mudjar trees. Often people will come up and go, what are all these dots? Am I allowed to dig a hole here or whatever? And it's like, well, actually no, and we'll have a conversation about that. And so, yeah, we're seeing some early effects. There's so much more to go. And I think, yeah, it's endless, but fun place to start.
Great.
Hi, that was a fantastic presentation. What I wanted to ask is the information that is used on your layer, how were you able to sort of ascertain that? Were you looking at past reports, or were you involved with TOs in getting that information?
So for the majority of it, it's publicly available information, but I did work with the Perth Airport Partnership Agreement Group to get their support and also have their engagement as I continued through the project. But there wasn't any data I used in my report that wouldn't be available to anyone else, even the cultural map, just that images is publicly available too. So I wanted to be really clear when I did my project that it wasn't just something you could only do if you were working internally inside Perth Airport. The idea is, of course, that you could replicate the methodologies used and use similar data sets if you were located somewhere else.
Great, thanks, Sally. Just on the work that you did with the Perth Cultural Advisory Group, can you maybe explain a little bit around how you were able to work together to make sure that there was good connection, I guess, around cultural heritage, natural landscapes that you talked about, and what was their, were they initially sceptical? Like, what was that journey like in terms of that work together?
Thanks, Mandy. It was a long journey. It started early, and actually the whole project, I guess, seeded from one of the members of the Partnership Agreement Group, or the PAG group. When we were out, we were having a normal consultation meeting like we do regularly, and we were out and one of the members was talking about the mudja trees and just started sharing all sorts of knowledge and information about the significance of those. And it just occurred to me that, we don't map them, and thinking through the processes for approvals and heritage management, just thinking to myself, they're not mapped and they're not protected, and what does this mean? And they're clearly so important. And so it kind of seeded from that early conversation around the mudja trees. And then basically I would just keep touching bases. I thought, it would be good to go back to uni and do my honours. I'd raise that at the next meeting and see what the PAG thought about it. And then as they would show interest in certain areas, about Monday Swamp in particular, and a lot of discussion around Allawa Grove, but also around the intertwined histories and the non-Indigenous histories as well. Their stories crossed into that. So as I just kept updating them, they were just supportive the whole way. And if there was something a direction they didn't want me to see me go in, I sort of, you could tell and you would leave it at that. But honours is such a tight scope as a project as well, so I didn't have too many rabbit holes I could go down anyway.
Great. There's a couple of other questions. So first one, are there any plans to add to this data set through fieldwork and consultation?
Thank you. I'd love to add to it through fieldwork, but we'll have to see how we go with airport with that. That's kind of, controlled through a whole nother area, but there's edit functionalities there. So from my point of view and the role that I have, it's about thinking about, as all these data sets come in, keep my relationship with the GIS spatial team, because I give them a bit of a headache every now and then with all the crazy things I want to do, and try and keep up on their priority list and try and get all that data in there as we go. Thanks,
Right.
Mandy.
And the final question, unless someone sneaks one in quickly, just have you had any access to the crash site, and what's some of the thinking around future plans for that?
I tried to get out there on Friday, but unfortunately the people I was going with weren't able to make it. So that's still something I've bumped down the road in my calendar. I really want to get out there and have a look around and see if there's any sort of materials around on the surface. But it's also in the middle of a registered Aboriginal cultural heritage site. So it's a discussion that needs to be had with the PAG a bit more. I do just want to walk out there and have a look from the aerial image and think, is this a possible location? Other than that, it's a discussion with the PAG group and the traditional owners before anything else further can be done there.
Great, thank you. Any final questions before we wrap up? No. Oh, yep, just up the back. Great, there's some balance in the room. They've all been over here. I don't know what's happening over here, but come on, guys.
Hi, thank you for that great talk. My name's Kevin from the City of Belmont Museum.
Hi, Kelvin.
Belmont seems to, which the airport's in. We're doing research, will be in the future, on the old suburb of Newburn, which is now where the old new airport is. Will your GIS be available to the public or on public domain?
We haven't had a request yet, but I'm sure if a request comes through, then yeah, we can definitely look at that. That might be one of the future headaches I give our GIS team.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you very much, Sally.